The ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel with a gentle shudder that Ambassador barely noticed anymore. After 30 years of diplomatic service, he had grown used to the strange sensations of space travel. What he had not grown used to was the sight that filled the viewing screen before him. Nexus 7 hung in the darkness like a wounded eye. The planet's surface, usually bright with the lights of 3 major cities and dozens of smaller settlements, showed only patches of dim orange glow. The orbital stations that should have been blinking with activity sat dark and silent. No ships moved in the space around the world. No communications chattered across the standard frequencies. The colony had gone silent 4 days ago. No distress call, no warning, just silence. Pressed his thin, scaled fingers against the cold glass of the viewing port. His iridescent scales caught the light from the planet below, shifting from deep blue to pale green as he moved. Behind him, the bridge crew of the Tender Light worked quietly at their stations. Most of them were like himself, their elegant forms moving with the careful grace of their species. A few engineers clicked and hummed at the technical stations, their segmented bodies hunched over glowing displays. And then there were the humans. Turned to look at them. Stood near the navigation console, his arms crossed over his chest, studying the planet with an expression that could not read. The human was of average height for his species, which meant he stood nearly a head taller than most. His skin was a warm brown color, and his dark hair was cut short in the military style that many humans favored. Beside him, Petra was checking something on a small handheld device. She was taller than, with darker skin and hair that she kept in tight braids close to her scalp. Both of them wore the simple gray uniforms of civilian contractors, but something in the way they held themselves suggested they had worn other uniforms before. The humans had been added to the mission at the last moment. The Galactic Survey Corps had requested them specifically, though no one had explained why, had worked with humans before. They were a relatively new species to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only a few generations ago. They were friendly enough if somewhat strange. They laughed too loudly. They ate foods that would poison most other species. They seemed uncomfortable with long silences and always wanted to fill them with conversation. They also came from had read the reports about Earth, though he had never visited. The planet was classified as a Category 7 hazard zone, which meant that no non-human species could survive on its surface without extensive protective equipment. The gravity was crushing. The atmosphere was a corrosive mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. The temperature swung wildly between extremes that would kill most life forms. The planet was covered in liquid water that fell from the sky without warning. And the native life forms were, without exception, trying to kill each other at all times. Somehow humans had evolved in this nightmare. Somehow they had thrived. The ship's captain, a gray-scaled named, approached with a data tablet in her hands. Her movements were slow and careful, her tail dragging slightly behind her. Noticed the tension in her shoulders. "Ambassador," she said, her voice soft and musical in the way of their people. "We have completed our initial scans. The situation is worse than we thought." Took the tablet and studied the information displayed there. His stomach turned cold. "The environmental systems have failed," he said quietly. "All of them." Nodded. "The atmosphere processors are venting toxic compounds into the air. The gravity generators are malfunctioning, causing fluctuations across the entire colony, and the heating systems have shut down completely. Surface temperature is currently -40 degrees standard." Closed his eyes. The colony had been home to nearly 50,000 people. Most of them were with smaller populations of and other species. None of them could survive these conditions for long, were warm-weather creatures. Their blood flowed slowly in the cold. Below a certain temperature, they simply stopped moving. "Life signs?" he asked. "Concentrated in the central bunker," replied. "Perhaps 2,000 survivors, maybe less. We cannot get clear readings through the interference." "Then we must go down there and help them." hesitated. Ambassador, with respect, I cannot ask my crew to walk into those conditions. The gravity alone would crush most of us. And the cold. I will go myself if I must. You would die within minutes. A voice interrupted them. It was the human who had walked over without either of them noticing. His approach had been surprisingly quiet for someone so large. "What's the gravity reading?" he asked. Blinked at him, clearly surprised by the interruption. "It fluctuates between 1.8 and 2.3 standard units." Nodded slowly. "And the temperature?" -40 degrees. "That's not great," admitted. He glanced at Petra, who had joined him. "What do you think?" Petra shrugged. "I've done worse." Stared at them. "You cannot be serious. Those conditions would kill you." "They'd be uncomfortable," Petra corrected him. "But not lethal. Not immediately, anyway. We'd need proper gear, obviously. Thermal suits, maybe some portable oxygen just in case. But the gravity's not that bad. Earth standard is 1, but I've trained in environments up to 2.5. It's hard on the knees, but manageable." "And the cold?" asked. -40 degrees. Smiled, though there was no humor in it. "Ambassador, I grew up in a place called Minnesota. -40 is a normal winter night there. My grandmother used to walk to school in weather like that." Did not know if the human was joking. He had learned that humans often said things that sounded like jokes but were actually true, and things that sounded true but were actually jokes. He had never quite figured out how to tell the difference. "We'll need to assemble a team," Petra said, already pulling up maps on her device. "The bunker is about 8 kilometers from the nearest safe landing zone. Looks like the main roads are blocked by debris, so we'll have to go on foot through the maintenance tunnels." "On foot?" asked, her voice rising in disbelief. 8 kilometers in those conditions." "It's not that far," Petra said. 2 hours, maybe 3 if we have to clear obstacles." Looked at the two humans, trying to understand what he was seeing. They were not being brave, he realized. They were not being reckless. They genuinely did not seem to understand why everyone else thought this was impossible. "I will go with you," he said. Both humans and Captain all started to protest at once, held up a hand to silence them. "Those are my people down there," he said firmly. "I am the ranking diplomatic officer. I will not sit safely on this ship while others risk their lives for them." Studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you stay between us at all times. If you start to go down, you tell us immediately. No heroics." "I understand." The landing craft touched down on the surface of Nexus 7 an hour later. The moment the doors opened, felt the cold hit him like a physical blow. His lungs burned with each breath. His scales, normally smooth and flexible, felt stiff and brittle. The gravity pressed down on him from all sides, making each step feel like wading through thick mud. The 2 engineers who had volunteered for the mission collapsed within the first 5 minutes. Their exoskeletons, designed for the lighter gravity of their, cracked under the pressure. They had to be carried back to the ship by emergency drones. 3 crew members made it another 10 minutes before the cold became too much. Their movements grew slower and slower until they simply stopped, standing motionless like statues, their metabolisms shutting down to conserve heat. More drones arrived to take them back. And through it all, the humans just kept walking. Watched them through eyes that were beginning to blur from the cold, moved at the front, clearing debris from their path with quick, efficient movements. Petra stayed beside, occasionally reaching out to steady him when he stumbled. Neither of them seemed to be struggling. Their breath came in steady clouds of white mist. Their steps were firm and sure. "You should go back to the ship," said over his shoulder. "You're in bad shape, Ambassador." "I can continue," insisted, though his voice came out weaker than he intended. Petra looked at him with an expression that might have been concern. "Your scales are turning gray. Is that normal?" It was not normal. It was a sign that his body temperature was dropping to dangerous levels, but he had made a promise to himself. He would not abandon his people. "I will manage," he said. They entered the maintenance tunnels, and the wind died down. The temperature was still far below freezing, but at least they were sheltered from the worst of it. Emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting strange shadows that moved and jumped with each fluctuation of the power system. "The survivors are holed up in the central bunker," Petra said, checking her device. "They sent out a distress signal about an hour ago. It was weak, but we managed to pick it up." "What did it say?" asked. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It said something is hunting them in the dark." The three of them stood in silence for a moment. Somewhere deep in the tunnels, something moved, something large, something that made a sound like metal scraping against stone. "Well," said, pulling a heavy flashlight from his pack, "let's go introduce ourselves." And they walked deeper into the darkness. Had spent many years studying alien species. He had learned their languages, their customs, their ways of thinking. He had always believed that intelligence was the great equalizer, that any species that achieved space travel had proven itself capable and adaptable. But as he struggled through those frozen tunnels, watching the two humans move calmly through conditions that were killing him, he began to understand something that all his studies had never taught him. Humans were not better than other species. They were not smarter or more advanced, but they were built different. They were built by a world that wanted to kill them every single day, and they had survived anyway. They had walked out of the darkness before. They would do it again. The journey through the maintenance tunnels was the longest 8 kilometers of life. Every step felt like a small battle against gravity itself, against the cold that seeped through his thermal suit and wrapped around his bones like chains of ice. His breath came in short, painful gasps. His vision kept blurring at the edges, and he had to blink hard to keep the darkness from closing in. The humans walked beside him like it was nothing. Not quite nothing, he corrected himself as he watched them more carefully. Moved with deliberate steps, his muscles visibly tense under his suit. Petra rolled her shoulders occasionally and shifted her weight from foot to foot when they stopped to rest. They were feeling it. They were just feeling it in a completely different way than he was. "You okay back there, Ambassador?" called over his shoulder. "I am managing," replied, though the words came out slurred. His jaw felt stiff. His tongue was heavy in his mouth. Petra fell back to walk beside him. She was close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body. Humans ran hot, he remembered. Their internal temperature was nearly 15 degrees higher than us normal body heat. In this frozen tunnel, she was like a small furnace moving through the darkness. "Lean on me if you need to," she said quietly. "No shame in it. I cannot ask you to carry my weight as well as your own." "You're not asking, I'm offering," she smiled, and even in the dim emergency lighting it was a warm expression. "Besides, you don't weigh that much, have hollow bones, right?" "Our bones are not hollow, they are simply less dense than human bones." "Same thing." It was not the same thing, but did not have the energy to argue. He allowed himself to lean slightly against her shoulder and immediately felt the pressure on his legs ease. Petra did not even seem to notice the additional burden. She just kept walking, her stride unchanged. They moved deeper into the tunnels. The emergency lights grew dimmer and less reliable, flickering in irregular patterns that made the shadows jump and dance. Strange sounds echoed through the metal corridors, distant crashes, the groan of stressed infrastructure, and beneath it all something else, a scraping noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What do you think is making that sound?" asked. "Nothing good," replied. He had pulled out the heavy flashlight from his pack and was using it to scan the darkness ahead. "You said the distress signal mentioned something hunting the survivors." "Yes." "Any idea what kind of wildlife Nexus 7 has?" Tried to remember. His mind felt sluggish, like his thoughts were moving through thick liquid. The planet was surveyed before colonization. There were some large predators in the southern continents, but the colony was established in the north specifically to avoid them. The environmental barriers were supposed to keep any dangerous wildlife out. Environmental barriers that are now offline, Petra said. Yes, grunted. So whatever's down here, it's something that's been waiting outside for a long time, and now the doors are open. They walked in silence for a while after that, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping his eyes open, on not giving in to the overwhelming desire to just lie down and rest. Rest would mean death. He knew that. His body knew that. But it was getting harder and harder to convince his muscles to keep moving. Tell me about Petra said suddenly. Blinked at her, what? You're right, what's it like? It was such a strange question to ask in this moment. They were walking through a frozen tunnel on a dying colony, with unknown predators lurking in the darkness, and she wanted to hear about his planet. But then he understood. She was trying to keep him talking, trying to keep him conscious, trying to give his mind something to focus on besides the cold and the pain. Is a warm world, he said slowly. Very warm by human standards. Our average temperature is what you would call tropical. The light is different there, softer, more golden. When I first traveled to other worlds and saw the harsh white light of different stars, I did not understand how anyone could live under such brightness. Sounds nice, Petra said. It is beautiful, smiled at the memory. We have forests that glow at night. The trees absorb sunlight during the day and release it slowly after dark. When I was young, I would lie in the grass and watch the colors shift above me. Blue and green and purple, all moving together like living things. I'd like to see that someday. You would find it too hot, and the gravity would feel strange to you. Our world pulls more gently than yours. Petra laughed softly. You know, most species say the opposite. They say Earth's gravity is too strong. I have read the reports about Earth. Paused, gathering his thoughts. I confess I do not entirely understand how your species survived there. Sometimes we don't understand it either, called back. He had stopped at a junction in the tunnels and was checking his map. Left here. They turned left into a narrower corridor. The walls were lined with pipes and cables, and the ceiling was low enough that had to duck slightly as he walked. The scraping sound was louder here, closer. The thing about Earth, Petra said, continuing the conversation as if nothing was wrong, is that it doesn't give you a choice. You adapt or you die. Our ancestors didn't have the option of finding an easier place to live, so they figured it out. They learned to survive anywhere, deserts, mountains, frozen wastelands, places with no food, no water, nothing but rock and ice. They just kept going. But why? Asked. If the conditions were so difficult, why not simply stop? Why not accept that survival was impossible? Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't think we know how to stop. It's not in our nature. When humans encounter a problem, our first instinct isn't to give up. It's to figure out how to solve it. Even if the problem is impossible, even if everyone says it can't be done, we just keep trying. That sounds exhausting. It is, she admitted, but it's also how we got to the stars. They walked on. The scraping sound grew louder and then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Scales prickled with instinctive fear. Somewhere in his ancient genetic memory, prey animals were screaming at him to run, to hide, to do anything except walk forward into the darkness. The humans did not slow down. Getting close to the bunker, said, checking his device. Maybe another kilometer. What if the creatures are between us and the survivors? Asked. Then we go through them. Stared at the human's back. You say that so simply. It is simple. We need to get to the bunker. If something's in the way, we move it. That's all there is to it. But you have no weapons. How do you plan to fight creatures large enough to threaten an entire colony? Glanced back at him with an expression that might have been amusement. Ambassador, humans have been killing things bigger than us since before we invented fire. A sharp stick and some rocks were enough to bring down animals that weighed 10 times what we do. We're creative like that. They rounded another corner, and the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. This must have been some kind of maintenance hub, with multiple corridors branching off in different directions. Emergency lights cast a dim red glow over everything, and in the center of the chamber, blocking the path to the bunker, were the creatures. There were 6 of them, maybe 7. It was hard to tell where one ended and another began. They were large, easily twice the height of a human, with bodies that seemed to be made of overlapping plates of dark chitin. They had too many legs, too many eyes, and their mouths were lined with teeth that gleamed wetly in the red light. Felt his legs give out. Petra caught him before he hit the ground, holding him upright with one arm while she studied the creatures with an expression of calm assessment. "Big boys," she said quietly. "They are between us and the bunker," whispered. "We cannot get through." "Not right now," agreed. He was already backing up, pushing them gently but firmly toward the corridor they had come from. "We need to find another way around." The creatures had noticed them. They were turning, their too many eyes fixing on the 3 figures at the edge of the chamber. One of them made a sound, a deep chittering noise that seemed to vibrate in his chest. The others answered with sounds of their own. They were communicating, realized, coordinating. "Move," said, no longer gentle, "now." They retreated back into the corridor, moving as fast as failing body would allow. Behind them, the scraping sound started again. The creatures were following. "There has to be another route to the bunker," Petra said, her voice tight with urgency. "Ambassador, you know these tunnels." "I have never been here before, but the maintenance systems should have redundant pathways. If we can find an access panel, I can try to pull up a map." "Good. I'll slow them down." He was pulling things from his pack, a length of wire, a small canister of something, a knife. "Get him to the bunker, I'll catch up." "No," Petra started. "I'm not being heroic, I'm being practical. I can move faster alone, and someone needs to keep those things off your back." He flashed her a quick grin. "Besides, I've always wanted to test that old theory about persistence hunting." Did not understand what meant, but Petra clearly did. She nodded once, her expression tight. "Don't do anything stupid." "Define stupid." And then he was gone, slipping back down the corridor toward the approaching creatures with nothing but a knife and some wire, and the absolute certainty of a species that had never learned how to give up. Petra pulled in the other direction, moving fast despite his weight on her shoulder. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit suddenly changed. There was a crash, a screech, and then's voice, raised in what sounded almost like a war cry. "This way," gasped, spotting an access panel on the wall. "I can find us another route." His frozen fingers fumbled with the controls, but he managed to pull up a schematic of the tunnel system. There was another path to the bunker. It was longer, and it required climbing through several vertical shafts, but it would get them there. If they could make it in time. If could hold the creatures off long enough. If's body did not finally surrender to the cold. They started moving again, leaving the sounds of battle behind them. And as they climbed through the frozen darkness, found himself thinking about what Petra had said. About humans and their inability to stop, about surviving against impossible odds simply because giving up was not in their nature. He was beginning to understand now, not just intellectually but in his bones, in his frozen, aching bones. Humans were not special because they were strong or smart or advanced. They were special because they simply refused to die. The universe threw everything it had at them, and they just kept walking. And in this moment, stumbling through a frozen tunnel on a dying world, decided that he would walk with them, as far as he could, for as long as his body would carry him. He would not stop. He would not give up. He would be just this once, a little bit human. Petra and emerged from the final shaft into the corridor outside the bunker just as his legs finally gave out completely. The cold had seeped so deep into his body that he could no longer feel anything below his waist. His scales had turned from iridescent blue to a dull, lifeless gray. His eyes kept trying to close, and it took every bit of willpower he had left to keep them open. The bunker door was 30 meters away. It might as well have been 30 kilometers. "Come on," Petra said, pulling his arm over her shoulder. "We're almost there." "I cannot," he whispered. "My body will not respond." "Then I'll carry you." Before he could protest, she had scooped him up in her arms like he weighed nothing, which, compared to a human, he supposed he did. She started walking toward the bunker, her steps steady despite the crushing gravity and the extra weight. "This is not dignified," managed to say. "Dignity can wait, living comes first." The bunker door was sealed, but there was a communication panel beside it. Petra activated it with one hand while still holding with the other. "This is Petra with the Galactic Survey Corps. We're here to help. Open the door." There was a long moment of silence. Then a voice, thin and frightened, came through the speaker. "How do we know you're not one of them?" "One of what?" "The creatures. They're smart. They mimic sounds. They could be using you to trick us." Petra sighed. "Okay, fair point. What do you need to hear to believe me?" Another pause, then a different voice, older and calmer. "Tell us something only a person from the Survey Corps would know, something about the mission." The mission leader is ambassador of the diplomatic service. He insisted on coming down himself because he refused to sit safe on the ship while his people were in danger. He's currently hypothermic and barely conscious, so if you could open the door in the next few minutes, that would be really helpful. A third pause. Then the door began to open, sliding aside with a grinding sound that suggested the mechanisms were damaged. Warm air rushed out and felt it wash over him like a wave of liquid gold. His body, which had been shutting down piece by piece, suddenly remembered what it was supposed to do. His heart rate increased. His breathing deepened. His eyes, which had been drifting closed, snapped open. The survivors were crowded in the entrance of the bunker, staring at them. Most of them were, their scales showing the same gray tinge that Mark's own body. There were a handful of, their exoskeletons wrapped in layers of insulation, and here and there other species, all of them showing signs of the cold and fear and exhaustion that had marked the last several days. "Get him inside," someone said, and hands reached out to take from Petra's arms. He was carried to a makeshift medical station, where a healer immediately began working to raise his body temperature. Warm blankets were wrapped around him. Heated fluids were pressed to his lips. He drank, he breathed, he lived. From his position on the medical cot, he watched Petra survey the bunker. She moved through the crowd with quick, efficient steps, checking the condition of the survivors, examining the defenses, asking questions in a calm, steady voice that seemed to cut through the ambient fear like a knife through silk. "How many are you?" she asked. 1,800, someone replied. "Maybe a few more, it's hard to keep count." "Any injuries?" "Some. The creatures attacked twice before we sealed the doors. We lost 30 people in the first attack, another 12 in the second." Petra nodded. "What about supplies?" "We have enough food and water for maybe 3 more days. The heating systems are running on backup power. When that runs out..." She did not need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what would happen when the heat failed. Forced himself to sit up, ignoring the protests of the healer. "Where is the colony's administrator?" he asked. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge." A step forward. She was older than her scales faded to a soft silver color that spoke of many years. Her eyes were tired but sharp. "I am supervisor," she said. "I have been coordinating our survival efforts since the collapse." "Tell me what happened," said. The story came out in pieces. The environmental systems had failed all at once without warning. One moment everything was normal. The next, Alarms were screaming across every display, and the temperature was plummeting. The colony's engineers had tried to restore the systems, but something had corrupted the central computer. Every attempt to fix one problem created two more. And then the creatures had come. They had emerged from the wilderness beyond the colony's former barriers, drawn by the chaos or perhaps simply taking advantage of the opportunity. They were predators, that much was clear. Intelligent predators, capable of coordinating their attacks and learning from their failures. The colonists had tried to fight them off, but their weapons had proven largely ineffective against the creatures' armored bodies. The bunker had been their only hope. Built to withstand earthquakes and solar flares, it was the most secure structure in the colony. Nearly 2,000 people had managed to reach it before the creatures made the surface too dangerous to cross. That had been 4 days ago. Since then, they had been trapped, waiting for rescue, watching their supplies dwindle and their hope fade. "You are our rescue?" asked, her voice carefully neutral. "We are the first team," replied. "A full rescue fleet is on its way, but they will not arrive for another 2 days. We were sent ahead to assess the situation and assist where possible." 2 days, closed her eyes briefly. "Our heating will fail in less than 1. Then we will have to find another solution." The bunker's communication system crackled to life, making everyone jump. A voice came through, rough and breathless. "Petra, Ambassador, anyone copy?" It was. Petra was at the console in an instant. "Where are you?" "Outside the bunker, about 200 meters east. I led those things on a bit of a chase, but I've circled back around. Got a small problem, though." "How small?" "I count about 15 of the creatures between me and your position. They're not attacking, just kind of milling around. I think they're waiting for more of their friends to show up." Felt his stomach drop. 15 creatures, and if was right, more were coming. The bunker's door, already damaged, would not hold against a sustained assault. "Can you get to us?" Petra asked. A pause, then laughed, though there was no humor in it. "I could try to sneak past them, but I don't think that's going to work. They've got good noses. They know I'm here." "Then what's your plan?" "Well, I was thinking. These things are predators, right? And predators have certain instincts. When something runs, they chase. When something stands and fights, they get cautious. And when something acts like it's the biggest thing in the area." "What are you planning to do?" "Something my ancestors figured out a long time ago. Don't worry, I've got this." The communication cut out. Looked at Petra, searching her face for some sign of what was happening. What he saw there was not fear. It was not even concern. It was something closer to exasperated affection, the expression of someone watching a friend do something foolish but predictable. "What is he doing?" asked. "Being human," Petra replied. They made their way to the bunker's observation port, a thick window of reinforced glass that looked out over the colony's central plaza. The view was dim, lit only by the flickering emergency lights, but they could see movement in the shadows. The creatures were gathering, their dark forms sliding between the ruined buildings like living shadows. And then they saw. He walked out into the open space between the buildings with the casual confidence of someone going for a morning stroll. He had found a length of metal pipe somewhere and was carrying it across his shoulder. His breath misted in the cold air. His steps were slow and deliberate. The creatures noticed him. Of course they did. 15 pairs of eyes turned to track his movement. 15 bodies went still, assessing this new element. Stopped in the center of the plaza, he planted his feet. He raised the pipe. And then he started making noise. He banged the pipe against the ground, creating a rhythmic, echoing sound that bounced off the walls of the surrounding buildings. He shouted wordless challenges into the darkness. He spread his arms wide, making himself look as large as possible. It was the most primitive display had ever witnessed. It was ridiculous. It was absurd. And it was working. The creatures were confused. They had never encountered prey that acted like this. Prey was supposed to run. Prey was supposed to hide. Prey was not supposed to stand in the open, making loud noises and refusing to acknowledge danger. One of the creatures took a tentative step toward. He immediately turned to face it, raising the pipe and shouting again. The creature hesitated, its many eyes blinking in what might have been uncertainty. "What is he doing?" whispered Beside. "Why doesn't he run?" "Because running is what prey does," Petra said quietly. "And right now is not acting like prey. He's acting like a predator, a bigger, scarier predator than they are. But he's not. He's just one human with a metal pipe. They don't know that. They don't know anything about humans. All they see is a creature that isn't afraid of them. And in the wild, the only creatures that aren't afraid of predators are other predators." The standoff continued for several long minutes, held his ground, continuing his display of noise and movement. The creatures circled, watching, waiting for him to show weakness. He did not. Finally, slowly, the creatures began to withdraw, not running. Predators did not run from other predators, but backing away, giving ground to something that might be more dangerous than it looked. Waited until they had retreated into the shadows. Then he turned and walked toward the bunker, still moving with that same deliberate confidence. He did not look back. He did not run. He just walked. The bunker door opened for him and he stepped inside. The survivors stared at him with expressions of pure disbelief. He was covered in dust and what might have been blood. His thermal suit was torn in several places. He was breathing hard and his hands were shaking slightly. But he was smiling. "Told you I had it covered," he said to Petra. She punched him in the shoulder, hard enough to make him wince. "You're an idiot." "Yeah, probably, but an alive idiot." He looked around at the gathered survivors. "So, anyone got a first aid kit? I think one of those things scratched me somewhere along the way." The healer who had been treating rushed forward to examine his wounds. They were not serious, just deep scratches along his arm and side, but they needed to be cleaned and bandaged. Sat patiently through the treatment, answering questions from the survivors about what he had seen outside. Watched him and thought about what he had witnessed. A single human, armed with nothing but a piece of metal and an attitude, had faced down 15 alien predators. And he had won, not through strength or speed or technology, but through sheer psychological warfare. Humans had been doing this for millions of years, he realized. Before they had tools, before they had language, before they had anything that other species would recognize as civilization, they had been standing up to things that wanted to kill them and refusing to back down. It was not courage, exactly. Courage was when you were afraid and did something anyway, had not seemed afraid. He had simply done what needed to be done, what his ancestors had been doing since before recorded history. He had refused to be prey. Petra was already organizing the defense of the bunker. She had found maps of the surrounding area and was working with supervisor to identify possible routes for evacuation when the rescue fleet arrived. She was also improvising weapons from the materials available, teaching the survivors how to make simple traps and barriers. "The creatures will come back," she explained. "They're smart enough to figure out that display was a bluff, but now we know they can be intimidated. That's valuable information." "How does that help us?" one of the survivors asked. "It means they think like predators, and predators are predictable. They go after easy targets. They avoid dangerous ones, so we need to make sure we look dangerous." The night that followed was long and tense. The creatures did return, circling the bunker, testing the defenses. Each time the survivors made noise, showed strength, refused to act like prey. Each time the creatures eventually. It was not a permanent solution. The heating was still failing. The supplies were still dwindling. The creatures were still out there, waiting for the moment when the defenders grew too weak to fight back. But for now they were alive, and in 2 days the rescue fleet would arrive. Sat with and Petra in a quiet corner of the bunker, warming his hands around a cup of heated liquid. His body was slowly recovering, his scales regaining some of their color. He still felt weak, but he was alive. "Thank you," he said quietly, "both of you." "Just doing our job," replied. "No, you did more than that. You walked through conditions that should have killed you. You faced creatures that would send most species running. You saved my people." He paused, searching for the right words. "On my world, we have a saying. When someone saves your life, your lives are bound together. What affects one affects the other." Petra smiled. "On Earth, we just say you're welcome and offer to buy someone a drink. Then I will buy you many drinks when we return to the ship." "Deal." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, the creatures continued their endless patrol. Inside, the survivors huddled together for warmth, finding strength in each other's presence. "Ambassador," Petra said eventually, "you asked me earlier why humans don't give up, why we keep going even when things seem impossible." "Yes. I've been thinking about it, and I think the answer is that we don't really know how. Giving up isn't something we're built for. When we encounter a problem, our brains just automatically start looking for solutions. It doesn't matter if the problem is impossible. It doesn't matter if everyone says it can't be done. We can't help ourselves. We have to try." "That sounds like a curse as much as a gift." "Maybe it is." She looked at him with those strange, forward-facing human eyes. "But it's also how we survive, how we thrive, how we ended up out here among the stars, making friends with species we never imagined existed." She smiled. "It's how we ended up here, in a frozen bunker on a dying world, still fighting." "Still walking," said. "Still walking," she agreed. The rescue fleet arrived 2 days later, exactly on schedule. By then, the bunker's heating had failed completely, and the survivors were huddled together in a single room, sharing body heat and waiting for the end. The creatures had launched 3 more attacks, each one more determined than the last. But the defenders had held, they had made noise, they had shown strength, they had refused to give up. When the fleet's shuttles touched down and armed rescuers poured out, the creatures finally fled for good. They recognized superior force when they saw it. They were predators, after all, not suicidal. Stood at the entrance of the bunker, watching the survivors file out toward the waiting ships. Stopped beside him, her silver scales gleaming in the light of the rescue craft's spotlights. "You saved us," she said quietly. "You and the humans. We did what needed to be done. You nearly died doing it." "Yes." He looked out at the frozen landscape, at the ruined colony that had once been home to 50,000 people. "But we walked, all the way to the end, and that is what matters." And Petra emerged from the bunker behind him, carrying the last of their equipment. His wounds had been properly treated, and he moved with only a slight stiffness. Petra looked tired but satisfied. "Ready to go home, Ambassador?" she asked. Considered the question. Home. The warm, gentle world where he had been born. The world where the light was soft and the gravity was kind and the forests glowed at night. "Yes," he said, "but first I would like to make a stop." "Where?" He turned to face her, this human who had carried him through frozen tunnels and taught survivors how to fight back against impossible odds. This representative of a species that had evolved on and come out stronger for it. "I believe I promised you a drink," he said, "and I have always wanted to see Earth." Petra laughed, warm and genuine. "Ambassador, Earth would probably kill you." "Perhaps, but I am told that it is very beautiful, and I have learned recently that difficult things can still be worth doing." Clapped him on the shoulder, a human gesture of friendship that made stumble slightly. "Well, if you're serious, we'd be happy to show you around. Just stay close to us. And don't eat anything unless we tell you it's safe," Petra added. "And maybe stay out of the ocean. And definitely avoid anything called a national park." Looked between the two humans, seeing the humor in their eyes but also the genuine warmth beneath it. They were offering him something precious, a chance to see their world, to understand where they came from, to walk on the ground that had shaped a species unlike any other in the galaxy. "I would like that very much," he said. They walked together toward the waiting ships, leaving the frozen ruins of Nexus 7 behind them. The survivors were already boarding, eager to leave this nightmare behind, but found himself looking back one last time, trying to memorize the site of this place where he had nearly died, where he had learned what it meant to keep walking, where he had become, just for a moment, a little bit human. The journey home would be long. The reports would take weeks to write. The political consequences of the colony's collapse would ripple through galactic society for years to come. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was that they had survived, that they had walked through the impossible and come out the other side, that 1,800 people were going home because two humans had refused to accept defeat. Settled into his seat on the rescue ship, feeling the gentle vibration of the engines as they lifted off. Beside him, Petra was already dozing, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of the last few days, was staring out the window, watching Nexus 7 shrink beneath them. "You know," said quietly, "most species would call what we did impossible." "Yes," agreed. 1,800 survivors, one dead colony, two humans with no weapons and no plan. It sounds like a story no one would believe. Smiled. "That's the thing about humans, Ambassador. We're not very good at knowing what's impossible, so we just do it anyway." The ship rose higher, breaking through the clouds and into the clear darkness of space. Below them, Nexus 7 became just another point of light among millions. Another world with its own stories, its own tragedies, its own moments of impossible survival. And somewhere in the records of the Galactic Survey Corps, a report was being filed. A report that would be read by diplomats and military commanders and scientists across 100 worlds. A report that would change how the galaxy thought about a certain species from a certain on the edge of explored space. The report would say many things. It would detail the collapse of the colony and the heroic rescue of its survivors. It would describe the creatures that had hunted in the dark and the defenses that had held them back. But the most important part of the report was simple. It was the recommendation at the end, the one that had been composing in his head since the moment had walked into that plaza and stared down 15 predators with nothing but a pipe and an attitude. Humans should be reclassified from emerging species to strategic asset, not because they are stronger or smarter than other species, but because when the universe collapses around them, they simply keep walking. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered.